Hey, I'm Tony Moreland, and this is POW, Podcast of Wisdom from the Samsung Developer Program, where we talk about the latest tech, new trends, and give insight into all of the opportunities available for developers looking to create for Samsung. I sat down with Dan Appelquist, Director of Developer Advocacy for Samsung Internet. Dan first got involved with internet browsers way back when the internet first became a thing, and he was heavily involved with the web standards movement that was established at that time. Soon after, Dan relocated to London, England, and remains there today, working out of the Samsung UK office. Hey, Dan, thanks for coming onto the podcast. I'm going to start with a real simple question. Who exactly is Dan Appelquist?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the podcast. I really appreciate it. So I am Director of Developer Advocacy for Samsung Internet, which is Samsung's web browser. I'm also somebody who's been working on the web since before there was a web. So I have a background. I started working in startups in the early and mid 90s that were kind of working on web sites and web services for the publishing industry. I went on and became a .com CTO, being sent over to the UK from New York to be CTO for the street.co.uk, which was the UK arm of the street.com. I became a .com refugee. And because I was here in Europe at the time in the early 2000s, I became involved in a lot of projects that were helping to bring the web to mobile. And were helping to create digital mobile services, which was something where Europe at that time was a lot farther ahead than the US. So it was a very interesting and exciting time to kind of be working with companies like Vodafone, later Telefonica, to help build these kinds of services, emerging services for emerging devices and handsets and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that must have been pretty exciting to have been, working on technology really at the very beginning of something that was going to, honestly change our world forever. So why is it that you would say that Europe is further along than the US when it came to the start of the whole mobile web?
Well, when in, say, 2001, 2002, there were already color WAP phones that were coming onto the market here in the UK and elsewhere in Europe that were delivering digital services, like very simple digital services, but still digital services, news and online information and that kind of thing. Whereas I still had to really explain to my parents what it is that I was doing. Like, people at that time in the US really didn't think of their mobile phone as being for anything besides calling. Even text messaging was not very well understood as a medium because the interoperability wasn't there between the different carriers around text messaging. And it was only later that mobile digital services started to really develop, and then the mobile internet came out of that. Whereas in Europe, I would say my experience of it anyway was that with the standardization of GSM across the continent, you had a much stronger base for delivery of mobile services across a standard range of handsets, standard range of networks, all that kind of thing. All the technology was pretty standard.
And GSM is Global Systems for Mobile Communications?
That's right. Yeah.
So Samsung Internet, what exactly is Samsung Internet?
Right. So first of all, Samsung Internet is a web browser. And for those who are familiar with web browsers, other commonly known, commonly used web browsers, especially on desktop computers, include Google Chrome, Mozilla Firefox, Internet Explorer from Microsoft, which is increasingly being subsumed by Microsoft's new browser, which is Edge, and then Apple's Safari browser probably are the biggies, the ones that most people have heard about. When it comes to market share, and especially on mobile, Samsung Internet is also a browser that has a very strong market position. And that's because we ship by default with every Samsung device. We're also part of the Chromium project. We're a browser that's built on top of the Chromium open source project and code base. That is the same code base that Google Chrome is built on top of. It's also the same code base that Microsoft Edge is built on top of. So there's a community of companies and organizations that are contributing into that open source project, including Samsung. And what we're doing is we're taking that and we're delivering Samsung Internet for Android, which is our kind of premium browser that provides what we think of as the best user experience for the web definitely on Samsung devices, but we are also available across all Android devices. So any Android device, you can download and install Samsung Internet and use it as your primary browser.
Of course, my Android phone is a Samsung phone, so I didn't know that the Samsung Internet browser is available for all Android phones. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Do you have an idea of how many people use the Samsung Internet browser?
On Samsung devices, we're very high. On other devices, we're not that high. But part of the point of being on other devices is that it was very much a developer play to get. It was a minimal extra effort. I shouldn't say that because our engineering team is probably gritting their teeth and saying, "Are you kidding me? This was not minimal effort." But anyway, it was definitely worth the effort, because one of the key things that we go out to developers and talk about is testing and the importance of testing on Samsung Internet. And one of the things that we were hearing very early on when we started work in 2016 on developer advocacy for Samsung Internet was, well, we can't test. We don't have a Samsung device. Can you lend us a Samsung device? Well, being available on non-Samsung devices really made that conversation a lot easier, because we could just say, look, just download Samsung Internet and run it on whatever device you have, and you'll get that experience, and you'll be able to test. And testing across browsers is so important when you're building any kind of application, any kind of web application.
And that was the reason why the whole web standard movement started, wasn't it? Because we had so many different browsers that, often developers were having to create different versions of their website just to be compatible with the different browsers.
Yeah, certainly. The adherence to web standards has been a constant issue across the web. I think that things are a lot better now than they used to be. There are still differences in how in the user experience of the browser itself that can cause issues. I'll give you one example. Like, we have a feature on our browser, which is a scroll to the top of screen, which is a little button that appears overlaid on top of the web content that allows the user to, wherever they are, to scroll right back up to the top of the screen. Now, if the web developer didn't test their application in Samsung Internet, they might put a key piece of UI underneath that section of screen where we overlay the button. So things like that are these little micro issues that testing really helps. And that is not necessarily about web standards compliance. It's more about how you make sure that your web application runs correctly and all the UI is correct for the UI choices that browser has made and how it displays its UI.
I actually have a lot of experience with designing watch faces for our Samsung watches, and the same is true.
Yeah.
It's best to design around the system icons that may appear under certain circumstances so that you don't have any, usability issues.
Yeah.
So what has Samsung Internet done to drive awareness for developers?
So a lot of the work that we started off with when we started the team in 2016 was trying to drive market awareness of Samsung Internet. We already knew that because we had some stats that we had strong usage numbers. So we are roughly 10% of all mobile browsing in Europe, for instance. The issue was actually driving awareness amongst developers that they really needed to understand those numbers and therefore pay attention to testing and basically why they should pay attention to us as a browser. So we started off by working with people like StatCounter, that actually is one source that people use for global stats of different browsers. We then went on to work with Google Analytics. So we, after we had gotten StatCounter to kind of separate us off from Google Chrome, we then went to Google Analytics and we got them to separate us off from Google Chrome. And amazingly, after that happened, we started to get all these calls from different people. UK government was one example where they started to say, hey, we've just had this amazing jump in usage from Samsung Internet. Well, they didn't actually have a jump. They always had very high usage of Samsung Internet, but they just never knew it because Google Analytics was lumping us together with Google Chrome. So, and that's a problem with a lot of these stats keeper sites is that if they were not paying attention to your specific browser, they were lumping you together with a particular engine that the browser was based on. So getting that right was like a key element. And then we can take those numbers to other places and we can say, like, look, this is how many of your users or what percentage of your users are using Samsung Internet. We really think you would benefit from talking to us, or you would benefit from testing on Samsung Internet. Would you like to come do some joint projects with us? All that kind of stuff. We also have been working with places like MDN. So Mozilla Developer Network, or MDN, has recently, or within the last few years, has changed from a very Mozilla-specific website into basically a documentation website for the web across browsers. And what's underpinned that is that they now have a product advisory board, which includes people from Microsoft, Samsung, Mozilla, obviously Google. They also have people from a couple of smaller organizations such as Boku, which is a kind of open source development shop. So they have been doing a lot to kind of create and to reinforce the understanding that developers have that that's a cross-platform development site. So as part of our work there, we made sure that when there's a documentation page about a particular API and they have a list of browsers underneath that documentation, that is the listed supported browsers versions for that particular API, that Samsung Internet appears in that list. CanIUse.com is another example of a website that people use when they want to find out if they can use a particular API in a particular browser. They were also not separating us out from Chrome. So actually working with them and then working with them through MDN, we actually got them to use all of the MDN compatibility data, which is data that we update. That's data that our team goes in the background and updates through GitHub, through an open source procedure, so that all of that data is up to date, both on MDN and on CanIUse, so that developers have up-to-date information about which APIs they can use on which versions of which browser. And then in general, we've been doing a lot of things like writing blog posts. We write a lot of technical blog posts about the use of different APIs, the use of different technologies, opinion pieces about topics on the web. We tend to focus on things where Samsung has some kind of engineering investment. So things like progressive web apps, that's one area where we've done a lot of work recently. We've also done a lot of work on WebXR and the immersive web, and things like web payment, that kind of thing. We also sponsor conferences and we go out and speak at conferences and events. These days, we're doing a lot of virtual events, and we're really trying to play a leadership role in how the developer advocacy community deals with the current situation with the lockdown, by showing how you can very effectively engage with developers and create conversation with developers using virtual means.
I couldn't agree with you more. The timing with the launch of our new podcast here is actually right in line with probably what's going to be a huge change for all of the industries as we move forward in this new world of information sharing virtually.
Yeah.
I actually attended one of your virtual office hours, and it was nice because, you brought in some outside people, some industry people to participate.
And that's something that's a kind of ethos that we have had from the beginning. We actually ran a 2-day event in San Jose a couple of years ago called Samsung Create. And the whole idea of that was to feature Samsung people, yes, but at least half the speakers that we had were third-party speakers that we brought in from the industry. And we had an MDN speaker, we had a Microsoft speaker, we had a Google speaker. It also fits together with the fact that our team, besides doing developer advocacy and outreach, we're also doing a lot of industry work. So we do work in W3C. I co-chair a group in W3C, which is the World Wide Web Consortium that sets standards for the web. I co-chair a group there called the Technical Architecture Group, which is a kind of technical steering group for web standards. My colleague Ada co-chairs the Immersive Web Working Group, which is working on technologies that bring AR and VR to the web. So we're not only playing a role in terms of getting the word out about those technologies, but we're also playing a role in terms of setting those standards.
Is Samsung Internet just for Android?
The work that we're doing is on Samsung Internet for Android, and the team that we're attached to is Samsung Internet for Android. If you have a Samsung TV or if you have a Samsung watch, you may also know that there are other versions of Samsung Internet. They have the same logo and they are also based on Chromium, but they're actually built by different teams within Samsung divisions. So there's some cross-working between those different groups, especially because they're all using the Chromium base, and so they share a lot of knowledge and they share a lot of information. But actually, the work that we're doing, we focus on Samsung Internet for Android.
When you have improvements that you want to make to the Samsung Internet browser, are those released at the same time when new devices are released?
So one of the things that we did very early on, and I think this was right around the time when I started in 2016, is we unlinked browser releases from device releases. We're now rolling out on a regular cadence new releases of the browser that are released through Play Store and also through Galaxy Store. And we do sometimes do releases that are timed to device releases, but those are still in the context of our regular software release schedule. So, and that's really important for the web because the web needs to be evergreen. When there's a security vulnerability or some kind of new feature that web developers want to use, they don't want to have to wait for a new device to come out in order to be able to use that feature. Likewise, when there are features or technologies that are deprecated from the web stack, you really want to, either because they're vulnerable or they're difficult to use or they're just not very performant or however, you want to be able to make sure that you can update all the browsers to remove that feature.
You know, that's great to hear that that the updates are not tied to new device releases. You know, because I'm sure that developers are wanting to get those updates just as soon as possible, and you can get those features out to the developer community.
That's right. Yeah.
So tell me, what is the benefit of using Samsung Internet over another browser like, say, Google Chrome?
One of the things that we pride ourselves on is a focus on user privacy. So we think that we have better privacy features than Google Chrome. And that's certainly a goal that we have and something that you can see as evidenced through a lot of the features that we ship with the browser. So for instance, we have secret browsing mode, which is secured by Knox and also linked into our to biometrics on the device so that you can secure it with your fingerprint or your Face ID or however. We also integrate into Samsung Pay. Currently, that's only in the US, but there's a web feature called Web Payment, which integrates into Samsung Pay for US customers that allows you to pay directly from your web page using Samsung Pay, using the on-device payment technology. We integrate into One UI, so that's the Samsung-specific UI across the device, which our browser is based on top of. As part of the whole privacy consideration, we allow our users to download and install ad blockers. We allow them to download and install extensions, which can be privacy helping or can be other things like shopping related, for instance. We also allow you to choose your own default search engine. So we have, for a while now, allowed you to choose DuckDuckGo as a search engine, which is a very privacy-focused search engine. But with the release 11.2 that's about to come out, we've actually even increased that list more, and we have way more search engines that you can choose as your default search engine. You can't do that with Google Chrome. And we have our own built-in smart anti-tracking technology that uses machine learning on the phone to, in a very privacy-focused way, shield your browsing activity from unwanted tracking on the web, which is a major issue right now for a lot of users.
You know, it's pretty safe to say that just about everybody at some point has had something hacked, whether it's, a credit card or maybe it's an online account. So always happy to hear about, new technologies that will definitely help keep the internet safer. Can we talk a little bit about revenue? How does Samsung Internet create revenue?
Well, we are getting revenue from search referral. That's the same as every other browser that's out there. I mean, how do browsers make money? Browsers usually make money from search referral. We also have opportunities for business development when it comes to our quick access bar, which is region specific. So when you first load the browser, you're going to see a number of links that show up, on your kind of quick access screen. All of that is user configurable, and the user can change those whenever they want to, but it's about what the defaults are. Those are really how Samsung is making money. I think the other part of it is more of a strategic play. There are billions of users using the web. Why would Samsung want to cede that territory to somebody else instead of being able to control that user experience and provide the best user experience that we can?
That's great. So how does the web developer ecosystem differ from other developer ecosystems?
One thing that is important to think about with the web developer ecosystem is that it's inherently cross-browser, cross-device, and cross-OS. And that's true of the web in general. The web needs to be able to exist across different browsers, across different OSs, across different form factors. You need to be able to bring up your web page and have it work on your television as well as your laptop screen, as well as your phone. Responsive design and progressive enhancement have been some of the key technologies that web developers have been using to ensure that that can be the case. Feature detection, these kinds of things are really important when it comes to building websites. You're not just building for one particular device. You're not just building for one particular vendor. You've really got to be listening to and paying attention to a lot of different voices. When you enroll in a developer program for a specific platform, you tend to be focusing on one particular device or one particular brand, one particular OS. And that also provides some clarity, which can be a good thing. However, when you're developing for the web, you need to pay attention to all these different platforms and devices. That's where something where MDN can come in and why we're putting so much energy into that, because it can be a place where developers can come and find out information across those different platforms.
You had mentioned a little bit about progressive web apps. For new developers out there, can you explain what exactly is a progressive web app?
So a progressive web app is, I mentioned technologies like progressive enhancement and responsive web design, which help developers build web applications that can work well across different browsers, different OSs, different devices, different form factors. The idea of progressive web apps brings that to the next level, where we try and learn a little bit from the success of native applications on the mobile platform in particular, and are able to provide a very app-like user experience for the web application itself. So a really good example of a progressive web app, probably one of the best ones out there, is the Twitter PWA. A lot of people are removing Twitter from their phones entirely and simply removing the native app, I should say, from their phones entirely, and just using the progressive web app because it provides almost all of the same features, but in a much more lightweight and much more privacy-centric kind of way. Because when you're using the Twitter progressive web app, it's been saved from the browser, and therefore it runs inside of the browser, even though from a user perspective, it appears like any other application on the phone. It's actually running inside of the browser. So it's running in the same context as all the other browser tabs that you have going. So it's a bit like, I've called it having your cake and eating it too, in terms of being able to build something really easily, build something cross-platform, but also be able to enjoy that real estate on the phone home screen, push notifications that keep bringing the user attention back, ability to have through a service worker a kind of offline experience, all the kind of features that users expect from a regular native application, they can begin to expect from these kinds of progressive web apps.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about AR and VR as they relate to Samsung Internet. Can you share a little bit about what you were doing in those areas?
So Samsung Internet was one of the first browsers to launch the WebVR API. That API has actually been recently deprecated in favor of the WebXR API, which is the API that my colleague Ada has been chairing the working group to create. WebXR is a way to bring AR and VR into the browser. Now, if you are familiar with kind of AR and VR in a kind of game console type environment or scenario, or with very specialized equipment, then you might be scratching your head and thinking, well, why do I need AR and VR in my browser? It's because the target audience for these kinds of AR and VR applications in the web are a little bit more like casual games are to the gaming industry. We fully expect, and we have seen the development of web applications in the gaming space and also in the kind of enterprise space, where they take advantage of the technology in the browser to enable you to deliver a kind of virtual environment, a shared virtual environment that provides a lot of those kinds of advantages to an AR and VR experience, but you don't have to download any software. You don't have to make sure that your whole set of downloaded software is correct, and it works progressively across different environments. So a couple of years ago, we worked with BBC here in London to deliver a Doctor Who game that was coming out alongside of the launch of one of their seasons of Doctor Who. And it's basically like a very simple navigating the TARDIS. It's called the Time Vortex, navigating the TARDIS along a vortex and avoiding obstacles and that kind of thing. But the reason they were so interested in web VR at the time was that it's available across multiple browsers. They have a public service mandate where they're trying to get that application into as many hands as possible, into the hands of kids that may have an older phone that aren't going to have the latest up-to-date technology and an AR headset or a VR headset. Those are the kinds of use cases that I'm interested in. How do we get these tools of AR and VR into everybody's hands? And I think the web is well positioned to be that platform.
Definitely. Let's talk a little bit about success and challenges. Can you first tell me about some of the challenges that Samsung Internet has faced?
I think one of the challenges, and I alluded to it before maybe, is just recognition of Samsung Internet as a key browser. We know we are. We are increasingly driving that awareness amongst the developer community, but we still run across a lot of people who just never heard of us, or if they heard of us, they kind of dismissed us alongside of all the other OEM browsers. We like to say we're not actually like any of the other OEM browsers because, first of all, we have enormous market share our market share, their market share doesn't compare to ours. Second of all, we put a lot back into the web platform, and that's extremely important to us. We put a lot back into the open source side of it, and we put a lot back into the open standard side of it. So driving that has been a challenge and continues to be a challenge, but it's something that we took on, and we understand that and I think we're turning the corner on that one.
Sure, and there's a huge value when there are multiple browsers out there. I mean, if you go back to when Internet Explorer dominated the market and then Firefox came on board, that's when we started to see a much better browser experience, correct?
Yes, and in fact, that's another kind of philosophical point that drives the work of our team, is that we strongly believe in browser diversity. It's not a web where one browser dominates. Is not actually going to be a healthy web ecosystem. We are based on top of Chromium, but we have made different UI decisions and different decisions in terms of browser features than Chrome. And that's something that we think is important and helps drive the ecosystem forward. We also work with people through standards and through web developer advocacy in companies that are competitors. I mean, I work with people from Apple in the context of web standards in W3C quite often, and choices that they make in Safari help to drive the web forward in different areas than the choices that we make in Samsung Internet or the choices that Google makes in Chrome. It's a good example.
Definitely. So what are some of the areas of success for Samsung Internet?
So from the beginning, when we started things off in 2016, we started off with some ideas around how we were going to treat developer advocacy differently. One decision that we took was to ensure that our team is attached to the engineering group that is producing Samsung Internet. And so we have a strong connection to our own engineering team. And we work very closely with them, and we do joint work. And when we've done our own events, for instance, we've had members of our engineering team come over from Korea and speak at those events. And we have a strong relationship with them, and we see ourselves as primarily web developer engineers that are also doing advocacy. So that's one element. And I think the other thing that we're very keen on is promoting diversity and inclusion in the tech community in general and in the web developer community specifically. So, for instance, we have a diversity and inclusion statement about conference participation. And many organizations have these now. I'm very glad to see that many do. We started ours in 2016. When we put that in place, I actually used as a template a statement that the UK government digital service had come up with, so we were basically using what they had put in place and adapting it for our needs with reference to their work, obviously, where we will not participate in an event that doesn't have a good diversity credentials, that doesn't have a code of conduct, an enforcement policy, that kind of thing. That's why very often, if you attend any of our virtual meetings and meetups, you'll always see me at the beginning talking about the code of conduct and just reinforcing the enforcement procedure for it. So we take that very seriously, and we also put energy into events and activities that are specifically focused on driving better diversity and inclusion in tech. So there's something called Global Diversity CFP Day, which is a yearly event that happens across the world where people who are new to speaking in tech conferences can come and get mentorship from people who have more experience speaking in tech conferences about how to submit their proposals for tech conferences. And it's specifically focusing on getting more diverse speakers out there and driving more diversity and inclusion into the tech conference circuit in general. So that's something we participated in. We also sponsor events that are focused on particular on inclusion. Queer.js is a very good example where we sponsored that, and then we sponsored that in Berlin, and then we were very happy to see that it grew into a bigger thing after that. Yeah, that's something that we're putting a lot of energy into, and we've seen that come back to us in the form of, I think people really appreciate that. Anyway, the kind of developers that we want to work with appreciate that, and we really appreciate that kind of feedback cycle.
That's great. So what advice do you have for developers looking to build for Samsung Internet?
Sure. You can follow us on Twitter, first of all, at Samsung Internet. You can also follow us individually. I'm at Torgo, and I'm Torgo on Twitter. I'm Torgo, and I'm always talking about web standards and other web technologies. You can go to our developer hub, which is at samsunginter.net. And that links off to all kinds of places like our blog. We actually repost articles from our blog onto samsunginter.net. Our blog is on Medium, so you can follow us on Medium at Samsung Internet Dev. You can attend an office hours event. So if you go to meetup.com and you subscribe to our meetup group. So we're running a series of events through that meetup group. Other than that, the best way to kind of keep tabs on what we're doing is to pay attention to our Twitter. And we're also, by the way, posting all of those events on the Samsung Developer platform on developer.samsung.com. And you can pay attention to our LinkedIn page. We have a LinkedIn page. If you search for Samsung Internet, you'll find it on LinkedIn. And we're actually posting all of those blog posts and event notifications and all that kind of stuff there as well, trying to engage with that community.
That's excellent. Well, hey, Dan, I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and do this podcast with me. It was a lot of fun to not only learn about you, but also learn about Samsung Internet.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Looking to start creating for Samsung? Download the latest tools to code your next app. Or get software for designing apps without coding at all. Sell your apps to the world on the Samsung Galaxy Store. Check out developer.samsung.com today and start your journey with Samsung.
The PAL podcast is brought to you by the Samsung Developer Program and produced by Tony Moreland.